Our story begins with someone saying, "Someone said that reincarnation is like a roulette wheel. You can become a dog, a pig, or even a cockroach crawling on the ground. Then, if you're reborn as a human again, it means you've survived that roulette wheel. To get to this point, I survived this game based on luck, and compared to my previous life, which ended in overwork, this is hopeful for me. But the body I ended up reincarnating in is that of a secondary character in a dark novel I used to enjoy. And specifically, it's a character who was killed by an ex-villain in Chapter 1, a hopeless fool called Han Sha. Then the scene changes and a system is shown that says, Character, Han Sha. Overview, a beast tamer with no skills, on the verge of failure, very interested in black magic and currently researching it. A minor character who, due to his petty temperament, can't overcome the evolution process and ends up dying. Mana, 45. Stamina, 3. Intelligence, 20. Perception, 17. Charm, 4. Disposition, evil neutral. The protagonist then exclaims, "Damn, this is frustrating. It's bad enough being a disposable villain, but the moment of possession is just as awful." The sound of pigs eating is like listening to ASMR in the background, and here's the black magician's annex. He begins to wonder what kind of situation he's in and thinks, Han Sha, who was expected because of his innate mana, was rejected from the academy because of his lack of practical skills. One of the men then asks, "Who was that child?" And another man replies, "It was a child who is asking to enter just once." So we see the number 8, and one of the men talks about an unfortunate moment when Han Sha becomes a dark magician. Another man comments, "If he goes to the Ardal Academy, he could be very useful. So kid, come here. Do you really know the procedure for taking part in this?" The protagonist answers yes, and is told, after taking the recruit's blood and swearing the oath of black magic, you can leave this place. He thinks, how could I not know something so simple as that? Soon, this organization of black magicians that Han Sha will join will become a well-known evil force, which will be totally destroyed by the protagonists of the novel. If Han Sha joins the dark magicians, he too will be killed by the protagonists. In that case, instead of following that path, I need to think of a way to escape from this pit immediately. The system then says, synchronizing with Han Sha's perspective, synchronization 10%, synchronization 70%, synchronization complete. And then a recommendation appears, run away from the dark mages. The protagonist is very surprised by this message. A hooded man begins to hear a strange noise and asks, "What's that sound? Is something happening in the basement?" He then says, "I'll check it out. If you value your life, stay put." At this point, the protagonist realizes it's the perfect time to escape and starts running quickly up the stairs. Eventually, however, he gets tired and thinks to himself, "I seem to have climbed a long way out of the basement, but where the hell is this door?" Seeing a light approaching, he realizes he's heading in the right direction. He ends up at a door full of chains, but more hooded men appear, asking what's going on. One of them says, "A child has escaped from the 3rd floor of the basement, and he's from Ardal Academy. Could that boy be a spy?" The protagonist, desperate when he realizes they're talking about him, tries to open the door any way he can, but it won't budge. He thinks, in this situation, the only thing I can rely on is my memory, and that's something even the useless Han Sha can do. Then he reflects, Han Sha had no talent for white magic, but he was born with an impressive amount of mana and simply couldn't tell where to use it. In other words, he just needs to control it. When the protagonist, Lahan, begins to learn magic, he remembers that he must collect the flow of blood from his body with his fingertips. He then says, "Please, Hans, please succeed at this." He throws his mana at the door, but nothing happens and comments, "Man, that sounds about right, but my ability is still too weak." Suddenly, an animal's paw appears behind him, and when the boy looks back, he sees a kind of small dragon. When he sees this, he thinks that he really is doomed and that it's a dead end. However, the creature approaches him in a docile manner, and he wonders, why would a reptile be here? It looks like a dragon cub, but how did it get here? And why does it like people so much? He then says, "Darling, I can't take you with me." But the little dragon starts crying, and the boy ends up picking up the dragon and running off. He comments, "You're trying to get us caught. Besides, I can't adopt something I can't take responsibility for." However, on reflection, he thinks, perhaps in this situation, I should consider using the power of this creature. The system then says, the statistics are synchronized according to the owner's disposition. This increases his charm several times over. The system then says, master taming skill activated. Do you want to tame the suspicious puppy? The system continues, breed, name unknown, suspicious puppy, very friendly with you. Mana level, 50. Strength, 60. Agility, 35. Intelligence, 10. Flame breath, level 1. He then comments, according to the message, if the disposition of my past life is passed on, perhaps I can do this. But wait a minute, shouldn't there be an accept button or something? However, the system said absolutely nothing about this. He concludes, well, whatever. Do I need to say anything? Like, I'm going to tame you, like the protagonists in novels say? Actually, when it comes to taming, I have a lot of experience and talent. For this, I have my own techniques, and the first of them is trust, giving the animal security. He then takes the little dragon and asks it to trust him. He wonders if it's really going to work, and the system informs him that the taming has been successful. Suddenly, the dragon begins to fly and glow, but then stops and lands on the ground. He wonders if the dragon has ever been tamed so easily, and comments, well, whatever, I'll find out for myself. He then says, right, Ertil, first command, open that door now, expecting the little dragon to spit fire to melt the chains. He is surprised when the dragon just goes up to the padlock and destroys it with one bite, blowing everything off. The protagonist compliments him, well done, Ertil. However, the hooded men comment, so that means the rat was hiding here, doesn't it? The protagonist thinks, shit, I thought things were going well. The men ask him to capture the boy and, desperate, he realizes he has to think fast. If I can't think of something, I won't get out of this situation, he reflects. He remembers that the first self-defense magic you learn when you enter the academy is a magic that spreads smoke and hides you. Even someone like Han Sha, who had no talent whatsoever for controlling magic, learned this because it's the basics of the basics. I've never really done it before, but I have no choice. He regulates his breathing, concentrates his energy in his fingertips and imagines filling the cave with pure white smoke. He desperately asks for it to work as he was trying to cleanse all the evil deeds that character had committed. Suddenly, the whole place is covered in smoke, and he's glad the magic worked. He quickly heads for the door to try and escape, but suddenly something emerges from the shadows and grabs his neck. He thinks, I really can't breathe now. Is this the end of me? The attacker comments that if he gives up now, he'll kill him painlessly, and the protagonist thinks, that's the same, in the end you're gonna kill me anyway. I can't see the opponent hiding in the smoke, and there's no way out with the black magic that Han Sha knows. In that case, the only variable is that little dragon. He then addresses the little dragon. Hey you, do you really want to get out of here with me? I'm sorry, but with my lousy skills, I'll have to control you. So please cooperate with me. At that moment, the little dragon starts growling and goes into attack mode. It flies up and launches a blast of fire, burning all the hooded men, freeing the protagonist from the dark magic. The protagonist, surprised, comments, I really can't believe you did that. Well, now I owe you my life. As promised, I'm taking you with me. But first, let's get out of this miserable cave. They end up leaving the cave, and the protagonist says, it feels like we've been walking through the desert for an hour, and so far there's no one in sight. I really don't want to be caught by the dark wizards again. Just then, he sees a carriage approaching and catches the eye of the man driving it. He asks, excuse me, could you give us a ride? The man asks if he has any money, and the protagonist asks him to wait a moment, offering a gold credit card. The man comments, a child sponsored by the Ardal Academy? They might classify it as something out of the country, but they'll probably accept it. The man allows him to climb into the carriage, and the protagonist thanks him. The man then asks where the boy would like to go, and he thinks, well, we ran away, but the black magicians might find us. They probably don't want their information leaked, and if we're discovered, we'll be killed immediately. I really don't have any other choice. Even though there are many people who want to kill me, the safest place right now is the stage of this novel. He then says, please take me to Ardal Academy. The scene changes to a woman, who comments, really, this is amazing every time I see it. She was the second-year assistant teacher at Ardal Academy, called Seelan. She thinks, the luxurious marble floor, the elegant chandelier, even the atmosphere of the students' uniforms, it all conveys prestige. However, she asks herself, what is this in front of me? She was looking at the protagonist all dirty and wondered, in this sacred academy, is there really such a crude student? She thinks, who could have tarnished the dignity of Ardal Academy and on the very first day of the semester? Then she says, ah, so it's you, isn't it, Han Sha? The one who can't even control his own innate magic and is on the verge of failure. Meanwhile, the boy was just trying to hide his little dragon. He then wondered who the woman in front of him was was and whether she was a teacher. He approached her and asked if she was late, to which she replied that she was a little late. He thinks that if it had been anyone else, she would have fought with him, but as he was just a loser, she didn't have time to worry. This time, she decided to let it slide, since, for her, it wasn't worth worrying about someone like that. However, she ends up thinking, this guy is scary too. Rumor has it that he's very strange, involved in black magic with life-size dolls every night, and there's nothing good associated with him. She then taps him on the shoulder and asks him to come in quickly. He thanks her and promises that he'll arrive earlier from now on. He thought he was in second year now, and the atmosphere seemed very different. When he entered the room, he noticed that everyone was looking at him strangely, and commented that he had arrived in a carriage and was looking gloomier than expected. Hans H. thought, damn, of all the days to come, it had to be on the first day of the semester. People kept talking about him, wondering if he was going to drop out of the academy. At least he had arrived before the teacher. Since he'd been promoted, he shouldn't fail. Others commented that perhaps he had begged to pass. The protagonist then thinks, maybe Hans H's family lost some money or some teacher saw great potential in him and, using magic, wrote a letter of recommendation. But in any case, he barely made it to second grade, so it really isn't wrong. This time, I need to find a way to survive on my own in this crumbling world of soap operas. First, let's summarize the survival objectives in 2 steps. The first is to survive in silence. Hans H is a third-rate villain, violent and incompetent, who meets his end by being brutally buried alive by the protagonists. As the academy continues, the cause of Hans' death remains unknown. He's a very bad guy, but he's also disturbing. Since I don't know why he was murdered, I'll live in silence and be very careful. I'd rather suffer from overwork than be buried alive. The second step is to graduate from the academy safely. He then wonders why he came to life in this world. Hans H comes from a wealthy family, but his antics almost got him rejected by his own family. In fact, a diploma from the Ardal Academy would be a safer retirement plan. Graduates of the Ardal Academy are in demand everywhere. Instead of getting involved in a war with the protagonist and dying like in the original novel, I'll live as an ordinary, quiet student, making sure to avoid all possible death flags. Suddenly, the teacher enters the room, and he thinks, is that Professor Grint? If he's here, that means he's in charge of the second year. His name is Professor Grint from the magic department. I've heard that Professor Grint is no joke. Even his aura is very intense. His exam is so difficult that even the protagonist, Lean, had a hard time passing. The teacher then comments that this year's second-year students seem very good, and that he can already see that some of them stand out. The protagonist thinks, of course, all the main characters are in their second year, but if the class level is high, that means it will be even harder for Hans H to survive here. His position at the academy is very precarious. The Ardal Academy, where students aged 14 to 19 are enrolled, has a 6-year course known for its rigorous curriculum. Thanks to this, the competitiveness of the students is very high, making the environment a real arena for survival. Only 10% manage to graduate with significant results. He thinks about how difficult it all was and asks himself, how on earth am I going to compete with the main characters? In the original story, Hans H used black magic and grew up quickly, but since I decided to live in silence, that method is no longer realistic. The teacher then says that, even so, there are many students below standard, and that from the second year onwards, students without ability will not be able to continue at the academy. He looks directly at our protagonist as he says this. The teacher then announces the timetable for the entrance exams. At this point, a system appears in front of Hans H, saying, based on your experience, choose 3 subjects and take written and practical exams. He then thinks, he's just designed an ad with a magical illusion, and for an illusion that's very precise. That means this is the level of magic at the Ardal Academy. However, we can freely choose the exam subjects, which means that everyone can simply choose the subjects they're good at and pass the exams easily, right? There's no way Professor Grint's exam could be that easy from the start. Professor Grint then begins to explain all the subject choices. He tells them that each subject has a limited number of places and that they will be filled on a first-come, first-served basis. The order of choice will be determined by a random selection. The protagonist wonders why there is a lottery in a magical academy. The teacher goes on to say that he will personally draw the balls in the box containing all the students' names to determine the order. The protagonist is apprehensive, wondering if he really has to leave it to chance, and reflects, since I know almost nothing about magic, I need to be selected as early as possible to choose a subject that I can at least try. This really bothers him since he spent a whole year studying only black magic. The teacher draws lots and announces, the first student to choose his subject is Hans H. The protagonist, relieved, thinks he's finally saved. He then opens his system and decides, as I'm not yet able to operate mana, I'm going to skip the subjects focused on practice. I'm also going to avoid the courses that weren't mentioned in the original novel and those that seem too difficult. He reads the names of the subjects and wonders, why are all these course titles so complicated? Then he sees study of hydrology and rituals and comments, it looks difficult, but it's the only course that looks easy. Besides, it's theoretical, so if I memorize everything, I might be able to pass. The students mutter, that guy chose hydrology. Let's just ignore him. I'm sure he's laying the groundwork for us. The protagonist thinks, if they really know the Hans I'm familiar with, then this treatment is quite natural. I need to choose the other two remaining subjects and sit down as soon as possible. He looks at a course and wonders if it's really possible. At that moment, the scene changes and he thinks, before I died of overwork and ended up on this novel, I was a veterinary intern, and these three subjects seem very similar to mine. First, the study of hydrology and rituals was written with the unique principles of this world, but I can definitely apply the mathematical formulas I know. The next is monster anatomy and the basic study of domination and behavior. I'm a bit worried about that, but since I brought this guy with me, I'd better put him to good use. However, he decides that it wasn't the right time, as the dragon was trying to get out of his backpack. He pushes the dragon back, aware that there were many people watching. He thinks, a dragon born when Hans H couldn't even handle mana, that's just begging to arouse suspicion about me. He then gets up and leaves. The scene changes again, and he says, here's a place where you can run around freely. He was underground in the training dungeon of the Ardal Academy. He thinks, I've understood the theory to a certain extent. It's time to synchronize our taming. He asks, a ticket for the beginner's practice room, please. The attendant confirms, but as he looks at the dragon cub, he says, even though it's only a cub, bringing a dragon into the training room for beginners, please provide the names of the two participants. Hans H replies, I'm Hans H, a second-year student. However, when he tries to say the name of the little dragon, he realizes that he doesn't know it. The little dragon looks at him, as if begging him to give it a name. Hans H asks, do you want a nice name? He thinks for a moment and suggests, how about Igori? But the little dragon doesn't seem to like the name very much. Hans H tries again. Then how about Carcharodonsaurus? In my day, that was pretty cool. The dragon almost kills him with his gaze for giving such ridiculous names. Hans H continues, so that's not good either, is it? You're very demanding. How about Basilisk? This time, the dragon seems to like the name. The protagonist thinks it was a problem to understand so well what the dragon was feeling. The attendant then says, I'll register you as Basilisk. A maximum of 2 people can enter a training room at the same time, and there is currently 1 person in there. We also offer a weapons rental service for students. Hans H thinks, that sucks, but now is not the time to be picky about weapons. I should be grateful for anything they give me. He then says he's ready. The man then announces, as he opens the beginner's practice room, Gate 1, Hans H and Basilisk from the second year are entering. As soon as they pass through the door, they find themselves in a forest. Hans H comments, the quality of this landscape is really insane and beautiful. He looks at some colored cubes and says, well, that does look like slime. Even if it is a low-level monster, does it really need to look that weak? He turns to Basilisk. Do you see those things over there, those blocks? Now let's blow them all up. The scene changes and Basilisk is destroying all the slimes. However, Hans H doesn't seem too pleased and comments, it's as if Basilisk's dragon instincts have awakened. The terrifying creature from before is gone, and now he's like a fish in water. Hans H then decides, well, Basilisk, I think it's time I practiced a bit too. Suddenly, Hans H is attacked from behind, but quickly defends himself with his shield. He asks himself, what was that? Looking ahead, he realizes that there are many such enemies. He then comments, to defeat these things, I need to eliminate them all at once. He calls out to Basilisk, you've warmed up, haven't you? Then come over here. Let's do what we did before one more time. Now, melt those sugar cubes. Basilisk launches a gigantic blast of fire in the direction of the slimes, and in a few moments, destroys them all. Hans H is impressed by Basilisk's power and happily compliments him. Basilisk, you've done a good job. Let's keep taking them all out. Hours later, they are both completely exhausted, lying on the ground, unable to continue killing so many slimes. Hans H comments, alternating between taming magic and attacking the basilisk has made this whole practice very exhausting. He thinks, a dragon that carries out orders so well. I really need to give him something tasty to eat when we get back. Suddenly, Hans H hears a voice saying that something isn't right and wonders where it's coming from. Curious, he and Basilisk follow the voice and find a girl with her pet. The girl was shouting at her wolf to stop playing and attacking all those slimes, but the wolf seemed disobedient. Hans H can only wonder who that girl could be. The girl begs her wolf to stop, and Hans H comments, that's no way to treat a hellhound. She shouts at the wolf to sit down, but it turns its back and walks away. She follows him, wondering where he's gone, since she can no longer see him. Angrily, she threatens, wait until I catch you. Just then, she hears a calm voice saying, good boy, just sit down and lie there. Looking through the bushes, she sees that the hellhound is next to Hans H, who calmly comments, that's your hellhound, isn't it? I saw how you were training it, but that's not how you tame a hellhound. The girl is surprised at Hans H's audacity in giving her advice, and remembers that at the Ardal Academy, the most prestigious school in the Empire, she, a mage from the land, never got lower than 3rd place, even though she was a commoner and often ignored. Despite her natural talent, few could match her abilities. Even so, thanks to the lottery system for the entrance exams, she ended up getting stuck in the subject in which she is weakest, basic domestication. She confesses, I know that my taming skills are weak, which is why I came to practice here. My opponent is Hans H, who couldn't even tame a slime in his first year. Rumor has it that he's obsessed with black magic. I've seen him with my own eyes, crying on dark days. Yet what is happening in front of me now? How did this bastard manage to tame a hellhound so easily? She asks how he did it, and Hans H replies, I didn't do anything at all, but he seems to be much calmer now, so why don't you take him away? She takes her pet in her arms and thanks Hans H. Hans H asks, why did you choose a hellhound? It's a very difficult creature to tame for the first time. He continues, it's a very complex monster and has a high score. I figured you'd want to come first in the basic taming exam. Hans H then jokes, oh right, I thought you liked mud baths or something. The girl is irritated by the provocation and thinks, he's a nobleman, but he's talking to me, a commoner, like that? And what's that next to him? Could it be a dragon cub? He's only in his 2nd year and he's already taming a dragon. She reflects, the Hans H I knew is completely different from this one. Hans H, for his part, thinks, I followed Hans H, but maybe that's not so bad, is it? Maybe I can get some tips on how to tame the hellhound. She then comments, this is where you were before, right? Hans H answers yes. Then the girl comments that it looks like the training ground has been restarted after almost everyone was wiped out. She then says, this is a training ground, so just watch, and draws her sword. She strikes the slime with such force that it is thrown away, leaving a trail on the ground. Hans H, curious, asks why she is using such an intense approach and asks, do you like burying living things? The girl, irritated, replies, do you want me to bury you with them? Suddenly, a slime tries to attack the girl, but Hans H quickly defends her, saying that the slime was behind her. The girl, embarrassed, replies that she knew that, and Hans H, relieved, comments, really? What a relief then. Let's go. However, in her mind, she thinks, actually, I had no idea that monster was approaching from behind. The magical precision I've just seen is not that of a beginner. Who is this guy anyway? Suddenly, a blue light surrounds them, and Hans H asks the girl if there has always been a trap in that dungeon. She replies that she didn't know either. Just then, in the principal's office, someone enters and says, Headmaster, we have an emergency. There's a problem at the beginner's dungeon training camp. The principal asks if there has been a mistake in the spell and who is inside the dungeon now. The man replies, 2nd-year student Adele and young Hans H. The principal, concerned, comments that this is too bad. If it's Adele, she might be fine, but for Hans H, it might be too late. A boy with no talent and nothing to offer has no chance of surviving in that flawed dungeon. In the dungeon, a giant, fearsome creature appears before them. Hans H watches it and thinks, if there's a mistake in the dungeon's magic formula, the monsters will become abnormally stronger and bigger than is appropriate for the level. Hans H's chances of survival are almost non-existent, so we'd better get ready. Adele comments, look how those bugged slimes have turned the grass black and charred. No matter how many I defeat, they always come back. When I leave here, I'll never look at a slime salad again. My God, who makes salad with slime? Hans H, observing everything, thinks, even with this horde of slimes, this girl is doing surprisingly well. Her taming skills are basic, but she handles earth magic at a very advanced level. Could it be that her true identity is that of an earth mage destined to become a great sorceress? Adele? Certainly not, but that seems unlikely. The fierce Adele wouldn't be at an introductory training camp like this. And most importantly of all, unlike in the original story, she seems to be very kind. Sure, she can be a bit annoying, but she doesn't openly despise the notorious loser Hans H, so she must have a good character, right? Adele then asks why he's waving to himself instead of fighting, and Hans H replies that it's nothing, he was just calculating the time. He comments, if I count the time since we entered the dungeon, it must have been 3 hours. Why is there no news outside? Don't they know we're trapped? Adele reflects, now that I think about it, outside it's only been about 30 minutes, so there's not much we can do. They've made sure that the time inside the dungeon is slowed down so that all the students can train properly. Hans H continues, even if they discover the situation and come to rescue us, that means we'll have to hold out here for a few more hours. But if we stay in this place, it will seem impossible to survive. Adele asks angrily, why are you saying something so unlucky like that? Are you suggesting that we just sit here and wait to die? Hans H replies, of course not. He asks Adele to buy some time, and when she asks why, he replies, you'll see. Just stop some slimes getting close. It won't take long. Adele, surprised, asks if he expects her to deal with all those slimes on her own while he does whatever he wants. Hans H, ignoring her, had already left. She shouts, if you haven't fixed this after a while, and I use all my magic to buy time, you can be sure you'll be dead for real. Hans H thinks, she really doesn't look like a bad person. The little dragon is a little distressed, but Hans H reassures him, don't worry, I have a plan. He explains to himself, the method of dealing with a faulty dungeon also appears in the original series. It's an episode that highlights the difference between the skills of the protagonist, Luhan, and Hans H. In that scene, Hans H tried a method, but failed miserably. Looking at some plants, he says, found it, basilisk. Gather all the vines that look like that and bring them all to me. He reflects, Hans H used this method and was cursed by the readers for the rest of his life, but honestly, I don't think he's dumb enough to deserve it. Adele thinks, I've used a lot of magic, but I seem to be reaching my limit. What's taking Hans H so long? Then Hans H finally appears, saying he's finished. They see a square made of vines. Adele asks why he has made a barricade of plants, and Hans H instructs her to enter the barricade immediately. He explains, the method is simple, just run here. Hans H explains that the plan is to build a barricade and keep the monsters out, but Hans H missed 2 important points in the previous attempt, the amplification of fire and magic. Now, however, he has the ability to control both. He raises his hand and conjures a power that transforms into a bow and several arrows. Hans H comments, it finally worked. All I need to do now is add magic and fire to these magical arrows, and with Basilisk's help, that will be very easy. Hans H asks Basilisk to burn all the arrows, which become incandescent. He then launches them into the air like fireworks. When the arrows hit the ground, they burn up all the slimes. Hans H thinks, is this serious? Is this the magic of that hopeless Hans? The slimes have been buried here, and their remains are scattered all over the ground. The slime's poison comes into contact with the fire magic, causing an explosion. In these situations, it's enough to use a little magic and release a fire, and everything resolves itself calmly. Adele observes and comments, you also plan for the firestorm not to hit that barricade, right? Hans H replies, good observation. These vines have a fire-resistant effect. Now that we've burned everything around us, let's rest until the rescue comes. Adele thoughtfully reflects, of all people, it was Hans H who saved me. The nobles of the Artel Academy don't usually care about commoners, let alone people like me, whether they die or live. What's his motive for saving me? Hans H., noticing the look on her face, asks, "Why are you looking at me like that? Aren't you grateful that I helped you?" Adele replies, "I am grateful, just a little. After all, theoretically, I owe you my life, don't I?" Hans H. smiles and says, "Good. If you're grateful, could you do me a favor?" Adele agrees, but with reservations. "If it's something I can do, no problem. But if it's something very excessive or frightening, I don't know if I can help." Hans H. then asks her to keep secret the fact that he tamed a hellhound and everything that happened that day. Adele, suspicious, thinks there's something wrong with that because it doesn't make sense that he would want to hide himself like that. She wonders what kind of person he really is. After the incident, the teachers, perplexed about the mistake in the dungeon, distribute items as a reward to the students who completed the dungeon without serious injury and call them to the rectory. Hans H., on reflection, thinks that accumulating items will be useful for graduation, but there is something more important now. Hans H. then calls Basilisk, and the little dragon's system opens, revealing a cheerful and very sincere red dragon. He is described as having a mana level of 53, strength of 63, agility of 38, and intelligence of 13. His abilities include Breath of the Fire Dragon level 3, Flame Resistance, and Toxic Resistance. Hans H. comments, "The Fire Dragon's breath skill has been greatly increased by all the fire breaths in the dungeon. Also, the toxic resistance must have come from that bug in the slimes. I really don't know what those black mages were creating in the basement, but this little guy here, despite being a hatchling, has incredible talent. The growth rate is impressive, and the delicate control of breathing in an immense amount of mana makes him an overwhelming monster in every respect. Now that he's in my hands, I'll raise him properly." Hans H. continues, "I've gone through a lot of trouble to look after you, and you know what that means. See this here in my hand? It's a slime ball." He thinks, that short-haired person treated it like garbage, but in the original end, it's a superpowered item. He says to Basilisk, "It looks delicious, right? Do you want to try something like that?" However, the little dragon makes a disgusted face at the sight of the item. Hans H. insists, "This is really delicious, so at least try it. Since you've never eaten it, you can't know if it's good or not." Hans H. thinks, "I haven't even tried to eat it myself, and I never will in my lifetime." Reluctantly, the little dragon ends up eating the item, but then vomits, clearly nauseous. Hans H. comments, "It certainly must have tasted awful, but even so, Basilisk stats were affected, and some of its abilities, such as mana and toxin resistance, ended up increasing." Hans H. was very impressed with how quickly Basilisk absorbed the slime's abilities. He explains that slime spheres condense the inherent abilities of slimes, thus increasing the consumer stats. Just eating one has increased even a basic mana attribute, which would normally take a long time to increase. He realizes that, after eating the slime, his instinct to become stronger has increased, causing his appetite for these items to grow. At this point, Basilisk starts attacking the backpack and eating everything he finds. Basilisk's system begins to crash due to the level increase and improved attributes. Suddenly, Hans H. hears a knock on the door and sees Adele coming in, calling him. She says, "So you were here, were you?" Hans H. wonders what that short-haired girl wants and wonders if she has also been called to the rectory to receive items. Adele asks if he really doesn't care about that, since she solved the whole case by herself. She told everyone that she was the one who solved the slime's mistakes and that she's going to buy more items, and asks if he's heard about it. Hans H. asks her what she means by that, since he doesn't really care. He asks her to lower her voice a little, as her ears are hurting a lot. Hans H. thinks it's more important to preserve his life than the items, and a student at the Artel Academy has closed a dungeon. Hans H. was on the verge of failure. This is very sensational, and rumors have surfaced suggesting that black magic or cursed tools were used. Hans H. doesn't want to become famous in this way and says, "If it's sympathy, keep it to yourself. I really don't want it for myself." Adele asks why he's getting sympathy, since he doesn't even know who she is. She is indignant that he doesn't know her and asks how he cannot know her. Hans H. tries to cover his ears because of the volume of her voice and asks, "I really need to meet you. What's your name?" Adele replies that her name is Adela Stevia. This impresses Hans H., who remembers Adela, the great wizard of popular origin who has always been in the top 3 of the Artel Academy. She's one of the main characters who really buried Hans H. in the original. Hans H. thinks, "Surely I know who you are, the one who's going to kill me in the future." He feels pressured as he repeats these meaningless words in his mind and ponders whether he is hastening his own death. Adele, indifferent, says, "Anyway, if it's not sympathy, it's okay." She then asks, "By the way, Do you look in the mirror often? Hans H is surprised by the strange question, and Adele pulls him in front of a mirror, saying, "You'd better look right now. I can't imagine a person coming to the rectory to receive anything looking as deplorable as you do." It's a very polite way of calling someone ugly. When Hans H looks in the mirror, he is outraged to see what he looks like. He can't believe he's so dirty and mistreated. He thinks that, seeing his appearance, people must think he is a very dark person, and now understands that people were avoiding him not out of fear, but out of disgust because of his filthy appearance. He decides that he will take care of his hair first. The next day, Hans H arrives in the academy classroom, and everyone wonders who that boy is, as he looks very familiar. People notice the color of his hair and wonder if it could be Hans H. However, when they look at Hans H's face, they conclude that it couldn't be him, since his face doesn't look dark at all and is completely different. They commented that it looked like two people had swapped places. While Hans H is listening to all this, a man approaches him and asks, "Are you really Hans H? Have you had a polymorphic treatment or something? Tell me where you got it, because good things like that should be shared, don't you think?" Hans H thinks that the man, called Crack, is of public origin and motivated by an inferiority complex due to his history and ambiguous talent. Crack used to treat Hans H as his lackey to satisfy his own superiority. The red-haired boy asks Hans H if he's embarrassed and if changing his haircut won't change his pathetic way of speaking at all. Hans H thinks, "Can't I really just ignore this guy?" The man mockingly says, "So, cutting your hair has made you lose your mind, has it?" Hans H replies that he has nothing to say to him, so he was just ignoring what he was saying. The boy wonders if he's really going mad and comments, "A guy like you, Hans H, who was abandoned by his own family and lives crawling around like a lizard, how can you be so angry?" Hans H wonders if there is anything he can believe in and that he might consider being on his side. Suddenly, Hans H opens his backpack and calls Basilisk. He turns to the man and asks if he could repeat the words he has just said. Basilisk then begins to approach the man, preparing to burn him completely. So, that's the end of the video. I ask you to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Don't forget to become a member of the channel, so you'll have early and ad-free access to the videos on our channel, and until next time.